I was standing at my husband's funeral when his phone rang, and everything I thought I knew about my life began to unravel. The cemetery was quiet except for the soft murmur of voices and the distant hum of traffic beyond the iron gates, a low gray sky stretching endlessly above us, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And I remember gripping my black gloves tighter as the casket rested before me, polished wood reflecting a life that had ended too suddenly, too quietly. Robert had always hated silence. He used to fill every room with his laughter, his stories, his steady presence that made everything feel safe. But now there was nothing, just the weight of absence pressing against my chest, and beside me stood my son Daniel, tall and composed in a way that felt rehearsed rather than natural, and next to him, his wife Emily, her posture perfect, her expression carefully arranged into something that resembled grief but didn't quite reach her eyes. I noticed that right away. The way she didn't look at the casket for more than a second. The way her gaze drifted instead, scanning faces, measuring reactions, calculating something I couldn't yet name. The pastor's voice faded in and out as he spoke about Robert's kindness and integrity, words that should have comforted me, but instead felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's story. And then it happened. A sharp, unmistakable sound cutting through the stillness, a ringtone, soft but clear, coming from somewhere far too close. My heart stuttered as heads began to turn, confused whispers rippling through the small crowd, because everyone knew the same thing. Robert's phone had been buried with him. I felt the blood drain from my face as the sound came again, vibrating faintly against the quiet. And before anyone else could react, I stepped forward, my movements slow, almost mechanical, my fingers trembling as I reached toward the inside pocket of his suit jacket where the funeral director had placed his belongings just hours before. I pulled the phone free, the screen lighting up against the dull gray of the day, and for a second I just stared at it, my reflection faint in the glass, before my thumb moved on its own and unlocked it. There was no missed call, no name, just a single message glowing on the screen, 3 words that made my breath catch in my throat. Look behind you. I didn't think. I didn't question. I simply turned, slowly, as if my body already understood something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. And that's when I saw her, Emily, standing just a few feet away, her head tilted slightly, her lips curved into the faintest smile, not wide enough for anyone else to notice, not obvious enough to call out, but unmistakable once you saw it. And her eyes, they weren't sad, they weren't grieving. They were calm, steady, almost expectant, as if she had been waiting for that exact moment, waiting for me to turn around and meet her gaze. A chill spread through me, deeper than grief, colder than loss, something sharp and precise settling into place inside my chest. Because in that instant, I knew two things with absolute certainty. That message hadn't been meant for Robert, and whatever had happened to my husband, it hadn't been as simple as they wanted me to believe. I did not react, not the way a grieving widow is expected to. I simply turned back toward the casket and closed my husband's phone with steady fingers, as if nothing had happened, as if my heart was not pounding so loudly I could hear it over the wind. And I slipped the phone into my coat pocket without a word, because something inside me had already shifted, something quiet and cold that told me this was not the moment to ask questions. This was the moment to watch the rest of the service. Passed in a blur of polite condolences and rehearsed sympathy, neighbors touching my arm gently, distant relatives speaking in soft voices about how sudden it all was. But I barely heard them. My attention kept drifting back to Emily, the way she moved through the crowd with effortless composure, accepting hugs, nodding at kind words, never once losing that calm, controlled expression, and Daniel stayed close to her side, his hand resting lightly on her back, as if he needed reassurance more than she did. When the service ended and people began to leave, I noticed how quickly she stepped forward, taking charge of the small details, directing where the flowers should go, reminding Daniel about the luncheon arrangements, speaking to the funeral director with a familiarity that felt out of place, as if she had already been through this before, as if she knew exactly how everything should unfold. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, watching them, memorizing the way they interacted, the subtle glances, the unspoken signals, and when Daniel finally approached me, his expression softened just enough to look appropriate, He asked if I was ready to go home. Home. The word felt strange, hollow, because I was no longer certain what that place meant. The house Robert and I had lived in for over 30 years suddenly felt like a space I needed to see differently, not as a sanctuary, but as a place that might hold answers. The drive back was quiet. Daniel focused on the road while Emily sat in the front seat scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the screen, her reflection faint in the window, and I sat in the back seat alone, my hand resting inside my coat pocket, fingers brushing against Robert's phone. I waited until we were stopped at a red light before I glanced down at it again. The screen was dark now. No new messages, no missed calls, nothing that explained what I had seen, and yet I could not shake the feeling that it had been intentional, precise, meant only for me. When we pulled into the driveway, Emily was the first to step out, already speaking about what needed to be done next: paperwork, bank accounts, legal documents, her voice calm, efficient, almost eager, and Daniel nodded along, agreeing with everything she said, not once looking back at me, not once asking what I wanted. I followed them inside slowly, taking in the familiar scent of the house, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the way the afternoon light filtered through the curtains. Everything looked the same, but it felt different, like I had stepped into a version of my life that no longer belonged to me. And as Emily moved toward Robert's study, mentioning something about organizing his files, I felt that same chill settle deeper in my chest, because I realized she was not waiting. She was not grieving. She was moving forward, too quickly, too smoothly, as if she had been preparing for this long before today. And for the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to ask the question that had been forming in the silence, not out loud, not yet, but quietly, carefully, inside my own mind. What else had she already planned? Emily did not ask for permission when she walked into Robert's study. She simply opened the door and stepped inside as if it had always belonged to her. And I followed a few steps behind, slower, quieter, watching the way her eyes moved across the room, not with grief, but with purpose. The desk was exactly as Robert had left it, a neat stack of papers aligned at the corner, his reading glasses resting beside a yellow legal pad, a pen placed carefully on top as if he had only stepped away for a moment. And for a second I felt that familiar ache rise in my chest, but I pushed it down, because something else mattered more now. Emily moved straight to the filing cabinet, pulling open the top drawer without hesitation, as if she already knew what was inside, as if she had opened it before, and that was the first thing that made my breath catch. Robert had always been private about his documents. Even Daniel used to joke that his father treated paperwork like state secrets, and yet here she was, flipping through folders with practiced ease, her fingers moving quickly, confidently, not searching, but selecting. "We should start organizing everything," she said without looking at me, her tone light, almost helpful, but there was something underneath it, something sharp. "There is a lot to sort through, and the sooner we handle it, the better." I nodded slowly, saying nothing, because I wanted to hear more, because silence had always been my strongest ally. She pulled out a thick envelope and placed it on the desk, tapping it lightly with her finger. "This should be important," she added, glancing briefly at Daniel, who had just stepped into the doorway, his shoulders slightly tense, his expression unreadable. "Dad kept everything labeled," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, like he was repeating something he used to believe rather than something he knew to be true. I stepped closer to the desk, my eyes settling on the envelope. It had Robert's handwriting on it, clear and precise, but the seal had already been broken, not recently, not by accident, but carefully, deliberately, and I felt that cold sensation spread through me again, the same feeling I had at the cemetery, the same quiet certainty that something had already been set in motion long before I realized it. Emily noticed where I was looking and offered a small smile, one that did not quite reach her eyes. "I thought it would be best to review things early," she said, "just to avoid any confusion later." Confusion, the word lingered in the air, heavy with implication, as if she expected there to be disagreement, as if she was already preparing to control it. I reached out and touched the edge of the envelope, my fingers brushing against the paper, and for a moment I considered opening it right then, demanding answers, forcing everything into the light. But I did not, because something inside me held back, something cautious, patient. The The same instinct that had told me not to react at the funeral. I withdrew my hand slowly and stepped back. "You are right," I said calmly, my voice steady. "There is no need to rush." Emily's expression flickered, just for a second, a subtle shift that might have gone unnoticed if I had not been watching so closely. And in that brief moment, I saw it. Not grief, not concern, but irritation, quickly hidden, quickly replaced by that same composed calm. And that was when I understood something important. She was not just prepared, she was expecting control, expecting compliance, expecting me to step aside without question. Daniel cleared his throat and moved further into the room, avoiding my eyes again. And I realized then that whatever had been happening, whatever decisions had been made, I had not been part of them. I had been removed from the center of my own life without even noticing. And as Emily gathered a few documents and placed them neatly into a separate stack, I slipped my hand back into my coat pocket, my fingers closing around Robert's phone, because somewhere inside that silent device, I knew there was a piece of the truth she did not want me to find. I waited until the house fell quiet before I moved. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed the silence, the kind of silence where every small sound carried meaning, where nothing could hide behind conversation or distraction. Daniel and Emily had gone upstairs not long after dinner, their voices low, indistinct through the ceiling, and I remained in the living room with the lights dimmed, sitting in Robert's chair as if I could still feel the shape of him there, his absence pressing against me in a way that was no longer just grief. It was something sharper now, something focused. I took his phone out of my coat pocket and placed it carefully on the coffee table, staring at it for a long moment before touching it again. It felt different in my hands, heavier than it should have, as if it carried more than just messages and contacts, as if it held pieces of something. Unfinished, I unlocked the screen slowly, expecting nothing, preparing myself for silence. But the message was still there, unchanged. "Look behind you." 3 simple words that had already altered everything. I opened the message thread, my fingers steady despite the tension building in my chest. There was no name attached, no number saved, just a sequence of texts that stopped abruptly. The last one sent just minutes before the funeral began. I scrolled up, each movement careful, deliberate. And what I found was not panic, not confusion, but something else entirely. Short messages, spaced out over the past week. "Do not trust her." One read. Another simply said, "Check the documents." And then, "She knows you will not question it." I felt my breath slow as I read. Not faster, not panicked, but controlled, because the pattern was clear. This was not random. This was not a mistake. Robert had been communicating with someone who knew something, someone who had been trying to warn him, or maybe warn me. I leaned back slightly, my eyes still fixed on the screen, replaying the past few days in my mind. The subtle changes I had dismissed at the time, the way Robert had become quieter, more distracted, how he had started locking his study door, something he had never done before in 30 years, how he had hesitated before signing a document just 2 days ago, his pen hovering above the paper longer than usual, his expression distant, uncertain. I had noticed it then, but I had chosen not to ask, because after so many years, you learn to trust the rhythm of your life. You believe that nothing important can shift without you feeling it. But now I understood how wrong that belief had been. I tapped on the unknown number, considering calling it, considering forcing an answer out of the silence. But I stopped myself, because whatever this was, it was already moving, already unfolding, and rushing into it without understanding the full picture would only give someone else the advantage. Instead, I opened Robert's recent calls, scanning through the list. Most were familiar, friends, business contacts, routine conversations, but one number appeared repeatedly over the last few days, unsaved, unrecognized, and yet frequent enough to matter. I memorized it, not writing it down, not saving it, just committing it to memory the way I used to remember grocery lists and birthdays, because I did not want to leave a trace. I set the phone back down and sat there in the quiet, listening to the faint creak of the house settling around me. And for the first time since the funeral, I allowed the truth to settle fully into place. Robert had not been at peace in his final days. He had been trying to understand something, trying to protect something, and whatever he had discovered, whatever he had started to uncover, it had not ended with him. It had been passed on, quietly, deliberately, through a message that only I had seen, and as I looked toward the staircase where Emily had disappeared earlier, I felt that same cold certainty return, deeper now, stronger, because I no longer needed to guess where to start. I just needed to be patient enough to see how far it went. The next morning arrived too quietly, the kind of stillness that feels unnatural, as if the house itself was waiting to see what I would do next. Sunlight slipped through the curtains in thin lines across the kitchen floor, and for a moment, everything looked normal again. The coffee maker hummed softly, the scent of fresh brew filling the air, but nothing about it felt the same. I stood at the counter longer than necessary, holding the mug in both hands, letting the warmth ground me, because I knew that once I stepped out of that moment, I would not be able to pretend anymore. Emily entered the kitchen not long after, dressed neatly, composed as always, her hair perfectly in place, her expression calm, almost refreshed, as if the events of the past day had not touched her at all. "Good morning," she said lightly, reaching for a glass of water, her tone casual, controlled, and I studied her carefully, searching for any crack in that perfect exterior, any sign of strain, but there was none, only that same steady presence that now felt more deliberate than natural. Daniel followed a few minutes later, quieter, his eyes slightly tired, but even he seemed to move according to her rhythm, sitting where she sat, speaking when she spoke, as if his place in the room had been quietly adjusted over time. I took a slow sip of coffee and set the mug down, choosing my words carefully. "We should probably go through Robert's paperwork today," I said, keeping my voice neutral, almost agreeable. Emily nodded immediately, too quickly. "I was thinking the same thing," she replied, her eyes meeting mine just for a second, measuring, calculating. "It is important to get everything organized before anything gets overlooked." Overlooked, the word again, repeated like a pattern, and I noticed the way her fingers tightened slightly around the glass, just enough to reveal tension beneath the surface. Daniel glanced between us, uncertain, but said nothing, and that silence spoke louder than anything else. After breakfast, Emily led the way back to the study, not asking, not suggesting, simply moving forward with quiet authority, and I followed, this time more aware, more focused, every detail sharper, every movement carrying weight. She began sorting through the documents again, separating papers into neat stacks, her method precise, efficient, as if she had already done this once before and was simply repeating the process. I watched her hands, the way she paused for a fraction of a second before placing certain documents aside, the way she avoided others entirely, and then I saw it. A thin folder near the back of the drawer, slightly out of place, not aligned with the rest, and when she reached for it, her movement changed, slower, more cautious, as if she had not expected it to still be there. She hesitated, just briefly, before sliding it out. But instead of opening it, she placed it on a separate stack without comment, without explanation, and that was all I needed. I stepped closer, my voice calm, almost curious. "What is that one?" I asked, not pressing, not accusing, just enough to make her acknowledge it. Her eyes flickered toward me, then to Daniel, and for the first time since I had known her, she did not answer immediately. The silence stretched for a second too long, and then she smiled, that same practiced smile. "Just some older documents," she said, dismissive, controlled, but her hand remained resting on the folder, not letting go, not moving away, and in that moment, I understood something else. This was not just about control. This was about something she needed to keep hidden, something she had not expected me to notice. I nodded slowly, stepping back as if satisfied, as if I believed her, but inside, the pieces were beginning to connect, the messages, the warnings, the hesitation I had just seen, and I realized that whatever Robert had been trying to uncover, whatever he had been warned about, it was not gone. It was still here, sitting quietly in that room, in a thin folder she did not want me to open, and this time, I did not need to wonder what to do next. I only needed to wait for the moment when she would make her first mistake. I did not reach for the folder that day, not when Emily was watching, not when Daniel was standing just a few feet away pretending everything was normal, because patience had already begun to feel like my strongest advantage, and I could see it clearly now. The way Emily positioned herself between me and anything that mattered, the way she guided conversations, redirected attention, controlled the pace of every decision as if she had rehearsed it all long before Robert was gone. So instead, I stepped back and let her continue. I nodded when she spoke. I agreed when she suggested timelines. I even allowed her to assign small tasks to Daniel. Watching how easily he followed her lead, how naturally he deferred to her without question, and that told me more than any document could have, because whatever had been happening, it had not started recently. It had been building, quietly, steadily, until it became the structure they both now stood inside. Later that afternoon, when the house settled again into silence, I made my move, not toward the study, not yet, but toward something simpler, something that would not raise suspicion. I picked up Robert's phone and walked into the kitchen, setting it down beside my own, as if I were just organizing things, as if it were part of the normal process of sorting through belongings. And then I did something small, almost insignificant. I plugged it into the charger, because a dead phone tells no stories, and I needed it to stay alive, to keep whatever secrets it still held within reach. I waited until I heard Emily's footsteps upstairs, the soft creak of the hallway floorboards signaling she was in the bedroom, and Daniel's voice faint in the background, distracted, unaware. And only then did I return to the living room, sitting down with the phone in my lap, the screen lighting up. Slowly as it powered on fully, I opened the message thread again, reading each line more carefully this time. Not just the words, but the timing, the spacing, the intent behind them. And something new stood out, something I had missed before. One message, sent 2 nights before Robert died, was longer than the others, more urgent. She already moved the papers. Check the second drawer. Not the top one. My breath stilled as I read it again. Slower, letting each word settle into place. Second drawer, not the top one. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, picturing the study exactly as it was. The filing cabinet Emily had opened without hesitation. The top drawer she had gone through first, the one she had wanted me to see, and then the lower drawer she had not touched, not once, not even by accident. And suddenly everything aligned with a clarity that felt almost unsettling. Because it meant Robert had known, he had seen something, understood something, and he had tried to leave a path behind, a quiet trail of instructions meant for someone who would notice, someone who would question. I stood up slowly, the phone still in my hand, and listened again. The house was quiet. No movement from upstairs, no voices, just the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant ticking of the clock on the wall. And I realized this was the moment. Not dramatic, not rushed, just precise. I walked down the hallway toward the study, each step measured, controlled. And when I reached the door, I paused for just a second, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because once I opened that drawer, once I followed the path Robert had left for me, there would be no returning to the version of my life I had believed in before. I pushed the door open gently and stepped inside, my eyes moving immediately to the filing cabinet. And this time, I did not hesitate. I did not look at the top drawer. I reached directly for the second one, my fingers wrapping around the handle as I pulled it open. And as the drawer slid out with a soft, steady sound, I felt that same cold certainty settle deep within me again, stronger than ever. Because whatever Emily had tried to hide, whatever she believed I would never find, was no longer out of reach. The drawer opened smoothly, almost too easily, as if it had been waiting for me. And for a moment, I simply stood there looking at what was inside, not rushing, not touching anything yet, because I had already learned that the smallest details mattered, the arrangement, the order, the things that seemed out of place. The second drawer was not as organized as the top one, not as carefully maintained, which in itself told me something. Because Robert had always been precise, everything in its place, everything accounted for. But here, the folders were slightly uneven, a few edges bent, one file pushed further back than the others as if it had been hidden in a hurry or returned without care. I reached in slowly and pulled that file forward, my fingers brushing against the paper, and the moment I saw Robert's handwriting on the tab, my chest tightened. It was labeled simply, personal, nothing more, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that Emily would think to prioritize. I opened it carefully, my movements deliberate, and the first page was a document I recognized immediately, a copy of our original will, the one we had signed together years ago, the one that had always been clear, straightforward, everything shared, everything equal. But as I turned the page, I felt that same cold sensation spread through me again, because the next document was different, newer, the paper crisp, the ink darker, and at the bottom of the page was Robert's signature, unmistakable. But the contents had changed significantly. The house, the accounts, the majority of the assets, all redirected, not to me, not fully, but structured in a way that placed control elsewhere, conditional, restricted, and I did not need to read every line to understand what it meant. I had seen enough to recognize the pattern, the kind of arrangement that shifts power quietly, that limits access without making it obvious, that creates dependence where there had once been security. I turned another page, and this time it was not a legal document. It was a note, handwritten, folded once and placed carefully between the papers. And when I opened it, my hands did not shake. They remained steady, because I already knew this was why it had been hidden. Margaret. It began, simple, direct, his handwriting slightly uneven, as if written in haste or under pressure. If you are reading this, then I was right to be concerned. Do not trust what you were shown first. There are changes being made that I did not fully agree to, but I needed time to understand them, and I may not have that time anymore. I paused for a moment, letting the words settle, my eyes moving slowly across the page, taking in every detail, every stroke of the pen. Emily has been involved in decisions I did not authorize. She has access to documents before I see them, and things have been moved, adjusted, presented to me in ways that feel controlled. I cannot prove it yet, but I know something is wrong. I need you to look where others will not. I exhaled slowly, the air leaving my lungs in a controlled, measured way, because this was no longer suspicion, no longer instinct. This was confirmation, clear, deliberate, undeniable. I folded the note carefully and placed it back exactly where I had found it, not because I wanted to leave it hidden, but because I understood now that this was only the beginning. There would be more pieces, more layers, and revealing this too soon would only alert the person who had tried to keep it buried. I closed the file and returned it to the drawer, aligning it just as it had been, leaving no sign that it had been touched. And as I stood there in the quiet of the study, I felt something shift inside me, not grief, not anger, but clarity, a calm, focused understanding that the life I had believed in had been quietly altered without my knowledge, and that the person responsible was not grieving upstairs. She was waiting, just as I was now. But unlike her, I no longer needed to guess what game was being played. I only needed to decide how I would finish it. I did not sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind refused to slow down, every detail replaying itself with a clarity I had not allowed before. The message, the drawer, the note in Robert's handwriting, each piece fitting into place with a precision that left no room for doubt. And by the time the first light of morning crept through the curtains, I had already made my decision. I would not confront Emily, not yet, because confrontation would only give her time to adjust, to explain, to manipulate the narrative the way she had likely done so many times before. Instead, I would do what she did best. I would observe, I would wait, and I would let her believe that everything was proceeding exactly as she expected. Breakfast was quiet again, almost routine, and I made sure to move through it the same way I always had, pouring coffee, asking simple questions, nodding at her suggestions, giving her nothing to question, nothing to suspect, and I saw it in the way her shoulders relaxed, just slightly, the way her voice regained that smooth, controlled tone, because she believed she was still in control. She believed I had accepted everything without resistance, and that belief was exactly what I needed. Later that morning, she mentioned meeting with the lawyer, her tone casual, as if it were a simple step, an expected part of the process. We should finalize everything this week, she said, glancing at Daniel for agreement, and he nodded immediately, his trust placed entirely in her hands. I kept my expression neutral, thoughtful. Of course, I replied. It is important to handle things properly. And she smiled, satisfied, because I had just confirmed what she wanted to hear, that I would not interfere, that I would follow her lead. But what she did not see was the way I had already begun to move differently, more deliberately, after she left the room. I returned to the study once more, not to search, not to uncover something new, but to confirm what I already knew. I opened the second drawer again, checking the placement of the file, the position of the papers, making sure nothing had been disturbed, because if she realized it had been touched, everything would change. But it was exactly as I had left it untouched, undisturbed. And that told me something else. She had not come back to check. She had no reason to suspect that I had found anything, and that meant I still had time. I closed the drawer carefully and walked back into the hallway, my steps light, controlled, and as I passed the staircase, I heard her voice upstairs, speaking on the phone, low, but clear enough to catch a few words. "Yes, it is already arranged," she said, her tone calm, confident. "She will not question it." I paused for just a second, not long enough to be noticed, just enough to let the words settle, and then I continued walking as if I had heard nothing, because now I understood something even more important. This was not just about documents, not just about control. This was about certainty. She was certain of me, certain of my silence, certain of my compliance, and that certainty was her greatest weakness, because it meant she would not see what was coming. I stepped outside onto the back porch, the cool air sharp against my skin, and for a moment I allowed myself to breathe, to stand in the quiet without thinking, without analyzing, just feeling the weight of what had changed. And when I opened my eyes again, the world looked the same. The trees, the fence, the familiar shape of the yard Robert had cared for so carefully, but I was not the same. Not the woman who had stood at that funeral confused and grieving. Not the woman who had trusted without question. I was someone else. Now, someone who understood that the truth does not reveal itself all at once. It unfolds, slowly, deliberately. And the only way to see it clearly is to let it come to you, piece by piece, until there is nothing left to hide. And as I turned back toward the house, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I would let her continue. I would let her believe she was winning. And when the moment came, when everything was in place, I would not need to argue. I would not need to explain. I would simply show her that she had underestimated the one person she believed she had already removed from the game. The meeting with the lawyer was set for the following afternoon, and Emily made sure everything about it felt official, structured, controlled. She chose the time. She confirmed the appointment. She even selected what I should wear with a tone that sounded helpful, but carried an edge I could no longer ignore, and I agreed to all of it without hesitation, because the more she believed I was following her plan, the less she would question what I had already set in motion. The drive to the office was quiet. Daniel focused on the road again, his silence now something I understood rather than questioned, and Emily sat beside him, reviewing a folder on her lap, her fingers moving across the pages with a familiarity that told me she had seen every line before. When we arrived, the building stood tall and polished, glass reflecting the pale afternoon sky, everything about it designed to project certainty, authority, and control. We were led into a conference room with a long wooden table, the kind that made decisions feel permanent the moment they were spoken. Aloud, the lawyer greeted us with a measured professionalism, his expression neutral, but his eyes observant, and I noticed the brief flicker of surprise when he looked at me, not because I was there, but because I was not what he expected. I was not confused, not withdrawn, not passive. I sat down slowly, placing my hands neatly in front of me, and waited. Emily began speaking first, of course she did, outlining the situation, summarizing the documents, guiding the conversation exactly where she wanted it to go, her voice smooth, confident, as if everything had already been decided and we were simply there to formalize it. Daniel nodded along again, adding little, agreeing often, and the lawyer listened carefully, occasionally glancing at me as if expecting a reaction that never came. And when Emily finally turned toward me, offering a polite smile that suggested it was my turn to speak, I simply nodded once, acknowledging her, and then I reached into my bag and placed Robert's phone on the table, not dramatically, not forcefully, just quietly, deliberately, the screen lighting up as it touched the surface. And for the first time since we had arrived, Emily's composure shifted, not much, just a subtle tightening of her expression, a slight pause in her breathing. But it was enough. I tapped the screen and turned it toward the lawyer, the message thread open, the words clear. Do not trust her. Check the documents. She knows you will not question it. The room fell silent. Not heavy, not chaotic, just still, as if everything had paused to catch up with what had just been revealed. The lawyer leaned forward slightly, reading, his expression sharpening, and Daniel's gaze moved from the phone to Emily, confusion beginning to replace certainty. But I did not look at either of them. My eyes remained on Emily, watching, measuring, because this was the moment I had been waiting for. Not the moment of confrontation, but the moment of recognition, the moment when she realized that the story she had been controlling was no longer hers alone. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to reshape what had just been shown, but I did not give her the space. I reached into my bag again and placed the second item on the table, the folded note in Robert's handwriting. I did not unfold it. I did not read it aloud. I simply placed it there and let its presence speak for itself. And this time, there was no mistaking the change in her. The calm was gone, replaced by something sharper, something uncertain, and I finally spoke, my voice steady, quiet, carrying no anger, no accusation, only clarity. I think we should review everything carefully, I said, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, because I did not need to argue. I did not need to raise my voice. The truth was already in the room, already unfolding. And as I watched Emily's carefully constructed composure begin to slip, I understood something with absolute certainty. She had never expected me to look behind me, and that was the mistake that changed everything.